The Liberty Weekly Podcast, Episode 2.
The Constitution has no inherent authority or obligation. It has no authority or obligation at all, unless as a contract between man and man. And it does not so much as even purport to be a contract between persons now existing. Furthermore, we know historically that only a small portion even of the people then existing were consulted on the subject, or asked or permitted to express either their consent or dissent in any formal manner. Those persons, if any, who did give their consent formally are all dead now. And the Constitution, so far as it was their contract, died with them. They had no natural power or right to make it obligatory on their children. It is not only plainly impossible in the nature of things that they could bind their posterity, but they did not even attempt to bind them. Nevertheless, the writer thinks it proper to say that in his opinion, the Constitution is no such instrument as it has generally been assumed to be, but that by false interpretations and naked usurpations, the government has been made in practice a very widely and almost wholly different thing from what the Constitution itself purports to authorize. He has heretofore written much, and could write much more to prove that such is the truth. But whether the Constitution really be one thing or another, this much is certain, that it is either authorized such a government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back for Episode 2 of the Liberty Weekly Podcast. I'm your host, Pat McFarlane. You just heard some snippets there from Lysander Spooner's very famous piece, The Constitution of No Authority. For Episode 2, my co-host Jerry and I were going to have a discussion of the war on drugs, leading from some of our topics from Episode 1. But as we sat down to record it, we realized that we really had to put some more prep into it to really make it great for you guys. So as to not waste our entire recording session, we ended up revisiting a topic from Episode 1, which was the Constitution and paleoconservatism. So what follows is the result of that conversation, as I frankly bite off more than I could chew for the purposes of one podcast, and just talk about the nature of the Constitution, some of its political origins, and some of the problems with it that I see as being the main mechanism of why it is allowed the government that we do have today, unfortunately. So I hope you enjoy. Here's the episode. Welcome back, everyone, for the second episode of the Liberty Weekly Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Pat McFarlane, and joining me is my co-host, Jeremy McCullum. Jeremy?
Thank you, Pat.
Okay, Jeremy. So in this, our first episode, we were explaining a lot of the different buzz terms in the libertarian movement, like voluntarism, minarchism, anarcho-capitalism, terms like that. And we did stumble upon paleoconservatism and the Constitution, correct?
Yeah, we did. And I want to ask you more about, we want to expound upon that more right now. A few weeks ago, you came at me with an idea that really, really surprised me. It was something that I hadn't heard before within this movement. And it was that you believe, or you have an argument to make, that the Constitution was co-opted from the beginning to fail to stop the expansion of the government. It was purposely flawed. And that's really unusual to hear within the liberty movement. Normally you either hear indifference, you hear people like voluntarists saying that the Constitution doesn't matter, that it isn't something that gives people rights, or it's something that people give praise to as being a great document to be exalted, something that was, the first of its kind. And you had a different view on it.
Yeah, in a sense, when you're just first off the bat, I am very young in my study of the Constitution. I had, as a law student, you have to take equal protection law. which has to do mainly with the 14th Amendment and a lot of the social issues that have been decided by the Supreme Court. In my opinion, issues that they were never meant to decide. And then the second part is powers, and that's what I had this year, and that's basically understanding what the Constitution is and the separation of powers and that whole thing.
Yep.
But when you're looking at it, the whole thing is so infinitely complicated, and I think it would be maybe just a disjustice or inaccurate to say it was co-opted in the sense that you would normally think of it that way. You know what I mean? Because ultimately the Constitution was the result of compromise.
Okay.
But to go way back, I know a lot of voluntarists don't believe in the Constitution or think that it doesn't matter. I assure you it does matter, just because of the whole foundation that it's built upon.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that it inspired a lot of people to want liberty after it.
Mm-hmm. And even before building on the principles of the Magna Carta, when you really trace the Whigs of 1776, the original American revolutionaries, their ideology can be traced back to the levelers of Civil War England.
So I'm not too familiar with them, so tell me about them.
Yeah, okay. So we're getting a whole look at the Constitution here, and everything that I learned this semester in my American legal history class. And we had this conversation briefly before, I believe, weeks ago when this first
weeks
came
ago,
up.
But yeah.
So and this will be just a very not super detailed account of
superficial.
Yeah, superficial account. The entire political situation in England throughout their history is a struggle between Parliament and the sovereignty. And
the sovereignty meaning the king?
Yes, right? The king, the monarchy in this situation. And so there's what's called a theory of sovereignty.
Okay.
And I don't know if you've heard of this before, or it's...
I think I have an idea. Is it's a theory of sovereignty is like you're trying to figure out where sovereignty comes from.
Yes, and who holds the sovereignty.
Who holds it. And I know, like, I've heard of the term of like the divine right of kings, and that would be an idea that sovereignty is ordained by a god or gods, right?
Well, a definition of sovereignty is the ultimate political authority to make decisions. Maybe not to make decisions, but it's the ultimate manifestation of political authority within a political structure. And whereas we would say that the individual is sovereign, it didn't always end up, it wasn't always that way.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the king, in England, it was always the king had the absolute power to make decisions.
So, he would, at least within theory, he should be trumping the parliament. No one else should be able to tell him what to do.
Yes, at first. And then so you have the development of the parliament, and I'm sure it came out of the fiefdoms in the sense that, a monarch has his court and his the feudal system. And it kind of develops in the sense that the king ended up needing parliament, and that's where his power gets restricted.
Yeah.
And throughout the English history or British history is this relationship between Parliament and the king. And so the king, as monarchs tend to get in legal or financial trouble, not legal trouble.
Yeah.
And so they spend way more money than they have on, the arts. They're just not good. They have lavish parties.
Yeah, they don't have a clear reason not to spend money.
Yeah, they're spendthrifts. They like to have foreign wars. And in a sense, a lot of the history comes from the monarchs needing money to fund these wars and Parliament restricting that money and using the power to control the monarch. And so you have the transition of power from the monarch to the Parliament. And then you get the theory of parliamentary sovereignty. Which is the idea that Parliament is the true expression of the people, therefore Parliament holds the sovereignty. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so when you're saying the parliament expresses the people, is it still staying that the people are the one who it's important to represent or to have law made for, but then the parliament is the representation of that? Mm-hmm. Is there still, I guess in that, by this point with parliamentary sovereignty, is there an acknowledgement of the sovereignty of an individual at all at this time?
No.
Okay.
Not
really.
From my understanding,
Okay.
is that the ultimate expression of political authority under parliamentary sovereignty is so whatever Parliament says.
Yeah, that is
okay.
And
so throughout the British Civil War, you have Cromwell coming about, and England becomes a republic in a sense.
Yep.
That the Cromwell has possession of the army and therefore controls Parliament, and that's really when you see the factions, and it's chaos. I mean, a time of huge upheaval, and through it come about these different groups, and the moderates are mostly with Cromwell, and but there was a communist group, but within this group is the levelers, and they're very revolutionary, and they believe in the popular sovereignty.
Yeah.
And they argue that the government has a duty to do what the people say, and that sovereignty lies with the people. Therefore, if Parliament doesn't do what we say, we can revoke that.
Yeah.
Sound familiar?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And so if that sounds familiar to you guys at home, that is the theory that we have today. And so it comes from that tumultuous time, and it comes throughout the American Revolution, and this reemergence of the theory of popular sovereignty, ultimately as an expression, as the colonists are grabbing for any kind of legal authority by which to fight Parliament.
Yeah, so it seemed to me like you're making the case that the popular sovereignty was used more as a justification to resist the British, besides the actual reason to be resisting the British.
Yeah, I believe it was both.
Both,
actually,
okay.
Because Thomas Jefferson was a really big one that actually Thomas Jefferson appealed to King George, asking him, "Is there anything you can do to reassert your monarchical power against Parliament to fight these taxes?"
Right, yeah, because the taxes were leveled by Parliament, and yeah, which that's
so. I mean, throughout, I mean, it's a little more nuanced, but
Yeah.
throughout all of our movies, you see in The Patriot with Mel Gibson, they are saying, "Hang King George, hang King George." Well, it's nuanced, but Thomas Jefferson did ask King George if he would reassert. And this would be a step in the wrong direction.
Yes.
It's like asking the federal government to strike down a state law.
yeah,
And so that's kind of where the Constitution comes from, is establishing this popular sovereignty. And if we're getting into the Constitution again, but when we're getting into this new theory of sovereignty, you have the states who are the sovereign in that system. Once the British government ceased to exist, all sovereignty, if you're a social contract, classical liberal,
Yes.
who John Locke does believe in the social contract. He wrote about it in his second treatise of government. But what essentially you're getting, once the federal government ceases, or not the federal government, I'm stuck on that. But once the British government ceases to exist, all authority is then given from Parliament to the state legislatures, right? And so the Articles of Confederation were established, and they, as we all have learned in school, are not perfect.
Yeah.
They were not perfect, excuse me, but they existed as a compact, a loose confederation, hence the name, between the states.
Yeah.
And I was talking to someone the other day, a law school student, about it, and I said, if it were up to me, we'd still have the Articles of Confederation. And he laughed at me.
Was he laughed? He wasn't shocked? Or
Yeah, in a sense he was, because no one makes that argument. I mean, it's blasphemy to say that.
Yeah.
Even at like a high school level. And is that something you learned?
Absolutely, yeah. It was never the Articles of Confederation, from what I recall, from school weren't a lot of time was not spent on them, because it's a lot more interesting to talk about the mythology around the Constitution than the Articles of Confederation. And I remember the Articles of Confederation being described as something that so loosely controlled the states that they could just do whatever they wanted, and that was a bad thing. And that the British colonies were too separated from each other, and it was absolutely a good thing for them to be brought closer together through the Constitution. That was the
or the American colonies.
The American colonies should be brought together through the Constitution. That was the story that I always heard.
So, but and the Articles of Confederation were so terrible because we can't raise the military and we can't do all this taxation that we want to do.
All these terrible things.
So. And that's what the guy was saying. The Articles of Confederation were unworkable. How could you have that position? Whatever. And I was like, yeah, that's what they want you to think, buddy. Yeah. Like, the real reason why the Constitutional Convention happened was to amend the Articles, not to come about a brand new Constitution.
Yeah, but in the process, they just threw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yes. And so when I'm talking about the Constitution and talking about it as, in a sense, a silent coup d'etat.
Yeah.
Because essentially the whole irony about the American Revolution is that you could make the argument that the government that resulted after the revolution was more tyrannical in a sense than the British government was, in the sense of everyday life.
Yeah.
Because the British government was weak. There was a long distance, generally the colonists had a certain degree of freedom to govern themselves.
Yeah, it would be it'd be very difficult for the British to be able to micromanage the colonies because of the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yep, essentially. And a lot of, I don't want to say the colonists had it great under the British, because obviously the separation was probably something that needed to happen.
Yeah.
But a lot of what drove the Revolutionary War was British anger about the debt from the French and Indian War. And they had a fair case to say, hey,
we had this war for you.
Yeah.
And now, if anyone's going to pay for it, it should be the people that benefit from it.
Yeah. See, and that's not, I wouldn't disagree with that entirely, but thankfully, we have the creation of the United States, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
And in the long run, I would say it was for the better. But the government that resulted, in a sense, might have been, in a very practical, everyday sense, might have been more overreaching than if we were just left to our own devices and still citizens of Britain. And that's probably a little controversial, but in a sense, the Constitution is a flawed document because it's the result of compromise.
Yeah, compromise between two different ideals of government.
And in the Constitution, you have the anti-Republicans in the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah.
The anti-Republicans, or opponents of the Constitution, and they were generally people who we would look on with admiration, in my sense. Thomas Jefferson wasn't necessarily against the Constitution, but he was for smaller government. But thinking of famous anti-federalists, Brutus comes to mind, John Dickinson, John Taylor of Caroline, I believe. So you're getting these people, and they're very small, we would identify with them because they're super radical, small government people. And on the other side, you have the Federalists, the original Federalists, who James Madison comes to mind as the, quote, father of the Constitution.
Yeah.
John Adams, the name is failing me, Alexander Hamilton, people like that. And the Federalists really represented the old aristocracy, and they wanted to preserve that kind of aristocracy. And a lot of the Federalists openly praised the British governmental system within the constitutional conventions, which a lot of people find surprising.
Yeah, I definitely did.
John Adams wanted the president to be called His Majesty. Tom Woods talks a lot about this a lot.
Yeah. I remember when George once George Washington had been elected, people didn't really know. There was a strange sort of time where it's like, how are we going to address him? And I quite distinctly remember learning that a lot of the traditions around the presidency were really created by George Washington. Like the two-term limit was not in law until after FDR, I believe. Before then, it had always been just tradition to step down after 2 terms. While before, it was a lot of people thought that George Washington would be the president for his entire life. And
yeah, I'm not as well versed on that part as you might be, but you're right to say that as soon as the Constitution comes about, people are trying to figure out what it means, because there is jurisprudence that they can look to, and that's what they ended up doing to figure out what this means. But it's a brand new document.
For the people at home, what does jurisprudence mean?
Jurisprudence just means the line of cases that precede a given law.
So
judgment.
It's looking to history or tradition, you might say, about how to deal with a legal situation or quandary.
Yep. So, and I'm glad you pointed this out too, because some people might not know. I don't want to be throwing legalese out there and people are like, oh, what is he talking about?
Yeah.
But so
that's why I'm here.
Yes. Yeah. So jurisprudence basically is when you look at a case that's undecided, maybe that you're litigating right now. And in order to determine what the law is in this specific instance, we look to the string of cases that preceded it and dealt with the same question or similar questions.
Yeah.
And in that way, you can trace the life of the law and in an effort to determine what this new decision should be. And so as the Constitution emerges, you have judges at the state and federal level trying to figure out what the heck it means.
Yeah.
And what the theory of popular sovereignty means for that matter, and what the role of the judiciary should be in light of that new theory of popular sovereignty.
Yeah.
And that is where you get the fatal flaw. And it's one of the areas you get the fatal flaw here, the mortal wound that I was talking about in the last episode. And this mortal wound has to do with the split. And so in the Constitutional Convention, you have the two parties. You have the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. Well, after the Constitution is ratified, it stews for a while. People are trying to figure out what it means. And then comes Hamiltonian central banking. And people would know about this. The first bank of the United States was created under the General Welfare Clause. And some of these clauses to the Constitution, like the Necessary and Proper Clause, was used to justify this.
Ones that are more vague.
Vague. Yeah. And my proposition, and what we had said before, is that these vague clauses in the Constitution were put there by design and were assured during the constitutional debates and the ratification debates and in the Federalist Papers even.
Yeah.
It was, these clauses were defended as saying, oh, no, like that doesn't mean what.
Yeah, it's just something that, it's we can't cover everything. That's what that's there for. It's not, we're not trying to do anything that's against the spirit of the Constitution.
Yes.
That was what was argued in the conventions.
And it was assured that, okay, well, that's why we don't need a Bill of Rights, because the federal government can't do anything that the Constitution
doesn't enumerate
to them specifically. Thanks. Yeah.
Yep.
And so what you have throughout, well, essentially the Constitution, being this result of compromise, has these ambiguous clauses, which people were afraid about, and they predicted exactly what happened.
Yep.
But you have people like the Federalists saying, hey, no, don't worry, we're not going to use it that way. And then immediately afterwards turning it around and using these clauses to justify things like central banking,
Yeah.
which we will touch on in a future episode.
Oh, yes, we will.
Such a major point in our libertarian, Rothbardian especially, standpoint, against the Fed.
Yep.
Where did I leave off then?
These right after the
The ambiguous clauses.
the ambiguous clauses, yes.
Yeah. So, and I think the Federalist Papers, for those at home who might need a little explanation, the Federalist Papers were written anonymously. They were published papers throughout the United States, written anonymously by James Madison and
these were through pamphlets, right?
pamphlets and in actual publications too, like
Okay.
newspaper, I think. But Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, and these are like one of the biggest authorities cited in Supreme Court opinions for what the Constitution means. And it's funny because the Federalist Papers, written by Federalists, obviously, they were published after the majority of the states had already ratified the Constitution. So I think the weight given to the Federalist Papers is a little too much weight.
Yeah, it's skewed because it's something that like it didn't inform at least you're saying about half of the state's decision to ratify the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. And so you have the ratification debates, and the Constitution was ratified independently. Each state legislature ratified it independently, which goes to show that the Constitution was a compact between the states, and that the states retained. So remember we were talking before about how after the British government was gone, the states assumed that sovereignty.
Yeah, and with the ratification of the Constitution continued that assumption of the states being sovereign.
Yep. And so under that theory, the classical liberal theory of popular sovereignty, the individual takes they take their sovereign authority and they give it to the states.
Yep.
And under the compact theory, the states retaining that sovereignty took a portion of it and specifically delegated it to the federal government and created the federal government as a compact between the states.
Yep.
And that's how pretty much everyone understood the Constitution to be. Well, so then you have the Supreme Court.
Yep.
And the Supreme Court is headed by John Marshall, who is an ardent Federalist and a crony. If I don't like these guys, so I'm a little biased, but I think I'm justified because their actions led to a very bad result, which is an overreaching federal government. But so you have someone like John Marshall, and everybody loves him at law school.
Yeah.
He's widely respected. His opinions are considered to be genius, and in a sense, they were. I mean, he's a very, very smart man, but he takes the power. He sets the rules. He's the first Supreme Court justice.
Yeah.
And so that's where you have the mortal wound. And it doesn't begin. It begins with the central banking, essentially, but in a Supreme Court sense, it begins with McCulloch v. Maryland. It also begins with Marbury v. Madison, which preceded it. But so you have the question, now that you have popular sovereignty, you have the question of, okay, who holds the ultimate authority to interpret what the Constitution means?
Yeah, what individuals have that authority?
Yes, and it wasn't an issue underneath the British government because obviously it was Parliament. Whatever Parliament said was the law.
Yep.
And they did have a constitution in Britain. It was just not written down. It was just a general question of, okay, let's look at the jurisprudence. Let's look at the common law, which is jurisprudence, just looking at the string of decisions over time.
Yeah.
And trying to determine, okay, like what is that history, and would this new law go against it? And they have a process of doing that. And so the Supreme Courts in England would look at a law and say, it's probably unconstitutional. you should, we'll put a check mark on it and then send it back to the legislature, and the legislature can look at it and do what they want.
And so the legislature could, since they had the ultimate, since they had sovereignty, could they disregard this check mark and be like, no, it's constitutional now? Or
yeah, they could do whatever they wanted, essentially, because the judicial system over there was seen as a branch of the executive system.
Okay, yeah, so it was to carry out the executive decisions and law.
Yeah, in a sense, to not be an authority, but to be an interpreter.
Okay, yes, that makes sense. That does make sense. Yeah.
So they can check a law and send it back, and this is a little segue, but interestingly enough, now the British government essentially does have a constitution, because the European Union Bill of Rights has come in with a literal constitution that they should abide by. But still, the legislature reflects that sovereign authority.
Yeah.
And I don't know, and that was a little aside, and I'm not completely versed on how EU law works, so don't take me, but I know that they have to abide by the EU Bill of Rights.
As well as their own constitution.
Yeah, but then again, their own constitution is unwritten.
Yes.
And in a lot of sense, the EU Bill of Rights is probably more overreaching than, more limiting than what the English Bill of Rights or the English Constitution would be.
Yeah.
But in America, now you have that problem of like, okay, under our theory of popular sovereignty, who decides that?
Yeah, who decides what the Constitution actually means?
Yes. And in our system, and Marbury v. Madison established the doctrine of judicial review, which essentially puts the Supreme Court's job as being the interpreter of the Constitution. And that's what we know it as today.
Yeah, and so this was a surprise to me when I learned about this, that I assumed, I was always taught that it was planned like this. The Supreme Court was supposed to be the interpreter of the Constitution. It was supposed to limit the other two. Like, that's what I was always taught. But it sounds like this idea didn't begin. It didn't. At the ratification of the Constitution, that was not the job of the judiciary.
Yeah. Well, in a sense, it's not that it wasn't the job. It's that no one really knew. Like, no one knew how these were going to interact.
Oh, okay.
They had a theory. In fact, in the ratification debates or the actual Constitutional Convention, I believe it was Thomas Jefferson who proposed a system by which we could determine what laws are unconstitutional and what aren't. And I'd have to look more into that. But it was rejected.
Yeah.
And that has to do with the Supremacy Clause and what came about as a result of the Supremacy Clause, which essentially the Supremacy Clause is taken to mean all laws. The Supremacy Clause states all laws made pursuant to this Constitution will be the supreme law of the land. And in law school, they've taken that to mean that, okay, any old thing that the Supreme Court says the Constitution means is what it means, and everyone has to listen to it.
Yeah.
But I assure you that is not the case. All laws made in pursuance with the Constitution are meant to be supreme.
So all laws that agree with the Constitution, that fit the Constitution, are to be supreme, and ones that are not shouldn't be.
Are not supreme.
Yeah.
And that's how the logic would go, you would think.
Yeah.
But that's not what law school says, usually, is attorneys think that the Supremacy Clause means that any old law that the Supreme Court says is constitutional. And judicial review has a lot to do with that. So judicial review essentially is when the Supreme Court decides if a law is unconstitutional or not. Yeah. Which isn't super controversial, at least at the time. Okay. Right? So if you're looking at the state opinions, the state court opinions dealing with the Constitution before Marbury v. Madison, they do not like to strike down laws they do not like to use this power of judicial review to strike laws down. In fact, there's this difference between political questions and ministerial questions.
Could you explain that?
Yeah. So when it comes to separation of powers, the judicial branch is supposed to say what the law is. They're not supposed to make up what the law is. They're supposed to say what the law is.
Yeah.
And a political question would be something that we would vote on, usually. So an example of a political question would be like, should we impeach so-and-so?
Okay.
Should so-and-so be impeached? That's not a question for the court to decide. That's a question for the legislature to decide. And so the legislature under our system with separation of powers is supposed to represent, it's the law-making body. And that's a whole debate within law too, is like, okay, should judges grasp opportunities to change the law, or should they stand back in a sense and just say this is the law?
And then let the legislature do the grasping that
or the changing, or
the changing that they're not taking advantage of.
Yes, and so there throughout the constitutional law there is an admittance and a realization that this power of judicial review is very powerful. In a sense, I think the judiciary is the most powerful branch because its role in interpreting the Constitution and being the final authority of what it means.
Yeah.
The final arbiter of constitutionality. So if you're getting, we're kind of getting into legal theory, and that's all it is, I mean, essentially. Mm-hmm. But so there's more conservative people in the judiciary, and that, in fact, the Federalist Society, Neil Gorsuch comes to mind in particular, Scalia as well. They are known conservatively as people who are textualists. They will say they believe supremely that the role of the judiciary is to say what the law is. Which is the correct sentiment. But I think that even conservative justices like Scalia and Gorsuch have it wrong because they place so much emphasis on the text of the Constitution, and they don't really look to see what the Constitution meant according to the parties who signed the document. That would be the state legislatures. They don't put much emphasis on, and in fact, none of the Supreme Court opinions place much of an emphasis on the ratification debates or, what the parties to the Constitution really thought that they were signing with the document, or ratifying, rather. Funny, because I do not like the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
I think it's, as I was saying before, the main mechanism that has destroyed the Constitution throughout the years. And it's because Marbury v. Madison was taken to mean that the Constitution is the ultimate, the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of the Constitution. And that's not what the opinion says. The opinion just says, our job is to say what the law is. We have the power to say that a law is unconstitutional. But in following the development of the law in the state courts claimed, yes, we do have the power to interpret the Constitution and say what it means and what it is, but close calls are not the job of the judiciary. Okay?
Okay.
So throughout that, as the state courts are trying to decide what the Constitution means and interpret what it means, there is a solid rule that can be gleaned from that string of decisions that says, okay, in fact, it's grounds for impeachment for a judge to claim that authority, the ultimate authority to say whether a law is constitutional or not. If a judge takes that, it is an impeachable offense. But then we have, in the future, the Supreme Court coming to do just that.
Yeah.
And so I think that the Federalists, John Marshall in particular, grasped this opportunity to establish what the Constitution means. And they were in power immediately after the passage of the Constitution until the Jeffersonian Revolution, when he becomes president. Yeah. Thomas Jefferson does. And ultimately changes some things, but the ball was already rolling in that direction.
And Jefferson wasn't able to stop it.
Yes, and Jefferson himself didn't remark too greatly on the Marbury v. Madison decision. That's because it wasn't controversial. The power of judicial review had already been kind of established in a sense, just with that caveat that didn't make it to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
That, okay, close calls are a political question, which should be decided by either the voters or the constituents.
And not the courts.
And not the courts. But there is no mechanism for that. But what states' rights people like myself would say is that, well, the job... Like, okay, so who's going to say what the Constitution means? This is where nullification comes in. And nullification is the doctrine whereby states can declare federal laws unconstitutional.
Yeah.
And I've presented this at law school, and I've actually been relatively well received. I still think people think maybe I'm a kook.
Yeah.
But that's me being self-conscious about it. And so I wrote a paper about nullification. That was a lot of fun to do, also super stressful. But to say again, the doctrine of nullification basically states that a law not made in pursuance of the Constitution is no law, right? That's uncontroversial.
Yeah.
In fact, Alexander Hamilton said that a lot, especially in the Federalist Papers. But it goes to posit, following logic, that if law is does not agree with the Constitution, then it is not a law, and the states don't have to follow it.
Yeah.
And so the states, in making that decision, can assert that a law passed by the federal government is not constitutional. Therefore, we're not going to abide by it. And it's pretty gangster. I mean, it's pretty cool. And,
yeah.
And this doctrine is introduced by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And that's a topic we'll get into later. But for now, just to know that what nullification is. And essentially, I mean, the whole idea behind nullification is that it shouldn't be within the federal government's scope of power to determine what power the federal government has.
Yes.
And that's inherent in the problem of judicial review. So just to recap, we started
with talking about the history of the political theories that became before the Constitution that influenced its creation. That's where we began. And then we talked about how the Constitution was flawed in its creation, and there's and how it's interpreted poorly. You would say.
Yeah, poorly interpreted. So one thing that people usually don't understand about the Constitution is that the Bill of Rights do not apply. The Bill of Rights originally were not intended to apply to the states.
I remember, this is something I actually did learn. There was a case that Supreme Court saw that in its opinion, that's what it's called. In its opinion, applied the Bill of Rights to the states. And do you remember what year that was when that...
Well, actually, there wasn't one single incident when the Bill of Rights was applied to the states.
Was it just the individual?
It happened over time in a series. There are landmark cases where that has been the case, and none of them really come to mind immediately, just because I'm not prepared. That's for that question.
This wasn't what we were expecting to talk about today.
Yeah, it was not. So, but it's a good topic to discuss, especially because going through law school and learning about the Constitution, I realized that I did not have a good understanding of the Constitution. And what it meant and how it works. Mm-hmm. And it's very important.
And funnily enough, it sounds like you think that your peers don't have any idea of how the Constitution works either.
Actually, they do, which is the sad part, because they have an understanding of the Constitution that's incorrect. So it'd be better to be ignorant, I think. But funny things about the Constitution. You really don't have a good understanding it's hard to have a clear understanding of the large picture of America and the American experiment without having a grasp of the Constitution and how it works. And none of this stuff I really knew, to be honest, before last year.
Yeah.
So, I mean, even me, someone being a libertarian and being someone who considers themselves informed.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't know about, it's great to learn.
Yeah. Yeah. And so part of the vision too for the podcast, at least in my mind, was that the audience would learn as I learn, or learn as we learn.
Yes.
In the sense of, we're discovering these new topics, we're bringing them to you. We're teaching you as we learn. And so in that sense, I can also have the cop out of being like, hey, I'm just learning this stuff too. But I mean, that's not the case thoroughly. I do know what I'm talking about in certain things, but when someone calls me out on something, I can be like, hey,
we're all students.
Yeah, we're all students. I'm not an expert in XYZ. I just hold myself out as one. Yeah, so just to conclude with the whole thing about judicial review in general, judicial review it's an accepted legal doctrine at this point. So it's not controversial to say that the Supreme Court has the ultimate power to. In fact, that's what they teach you in class.
Yeah, that's what I was taught.
Yeah, is that the Supreme Court has the ultimate authority. But we've talked about a lot of things, the nature of the Constitution. It hasn't been as completely structured as I would have liked for a complete episode. This is the Constitution. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But to go back and to highlight, that the role of popular sovereignty, and that's the current theory, and I would say we would extend that to the individual.
Yeah.
Individual sovereignty. But that has other implications too, that we'll talk about later as well. But I just wanted to end with this quote, warning about the power of judicial review and ordaining all of that power in the Supreme Court. In a letter Thomas Jefferson wrote, to consider the judges of the Superior Court as the ultimate arbiters of the constitutional questions would be a dangerous doctrine, which would place us all under the despotism of an oligarchy. So that's a warning from Thomas Jefferson. I have another quote here from the language itself of the Virginia Resolution, and these are resolutions protesting the Alien and Sedition Acts, which we'll have an episode on as well. But in this part, the Virginia legislature, through James Madison, is basically saying that a spirit has in sundry instances been manifested by the federal government to enlarge its powers by forced construction of the constitutional charter which defines them, and that implications have appeared of a design to expound certain general phrases so as to destroy the meaning and effect of the particular enumeration which necessarily explains and limits the general phrases. So that's where Madison is talking about the Federalists conspiring to use those ambiguous phrases.
Yeah.
And especially Madison and Jefferson were against Hamilton's central bank. And so that has to do with that question, particularly as to what he's referring to, the central bank, but also the Alien and Sedition Acts, which jailed U.S. senators for speaking against John Adams.
I remember I was very surprised when I learned about them in school, because they sounded like absolute despotism.
Yeah.
And it's a really good thing that they went away.
Yep.
And it seems like things similar to that have been creeping in over time.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not, we're still able to criticize the government.
Yes.
That's not an act of treason yet.
Yeah. But these developments that a lot of people would see as being new things are not new at all. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Especially me a few years ago was like, oh, what's happening to our nation? We're having these things happen, but it's not new. As you can see from the Alien and Sedition Acts, as old as time, as old as the Republic itself, almost. But Madison continues there, complaining about those general phrases, and he says that the result of using these phrases would be to expand the federal government. The result would be to consolidate the states by degrees into one sovereignty. The obvious tendency and inevitable consequence of which would be to transform the present Republican system of the United States into an absolute, or at best, a mixed monarchy. And I would argue that's what we have today. I mean, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, a monarchy that, I mean, it's not a hereditary one.
Yeah.
But one with an elected monarch.
Yes, and with the ruling elites and the political class. And in a sense, that's exactly what Hamilton wanted, if you delve into that.
Yeah.
And so that kind of sums up that thought that I had about the Constitution. We thought it would make a good episode to talk about, and I hope that it has.
Yeah, we hope you enjoyed it.
Just in signing off here, I wanted to again talk about that email list. It really is the best way to experience the Liberty Weekly podcast here. I'm sure we have those giveaways going on, which the details of which aren't clear at this moment in time as we're recording. But signing up for that email list will get you content updates, personalized content updates from myself. It'll also get you a copy of our free ebook, Just Say No to Drug Prohibition. It'll definitely give you a lot of fodder to argue with people in favor of legalization. And also, we would encourage you to give us some feedback. What we were talking about before. We really are hungry for your opinions.
Yeah, let us know what you liked and what you're interested in hearing from us.
Yes, and so that, as we just talked about, we could use the podcast as a vehicle, not only for us to learn, but for us to bring that knowledge to you as well. So thank you for joining us for this episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. We certainly hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, review us on iTunes or any other platform, whatever platform you're hearing this podcast from today. So once again, thank you, and we hope that you join us for next time.